Welcome. What is Titan? A no-code platform for Salesforce. What can you do with Titan? You can build forms, portals, document generation, e-signatures, maps, automation, and a lot more. Security is really important to us. Therefore, we are HIPAA compliant, PCI SSC compliant, GDPR 508, and ISO compliant. So, what are you waiting for? Schedule a demo with us at Form Titan and let us build the impossible for Salesforce.
We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.
Well, hey, thanks everybody for joining. It's the top of the hour by my clock. We're excited to have Don Robbins here presenting Exploring Drag and Drop with Lightning Web Components for our session on the developer track in virtual Dreamin. I will hand it over to Don Robbins for the presentation. Thanks, Don.
Thank you, Mike. I'm just going to share my entire desktop here, and I'll go into full screen mode. And you're going to tell me if anything is not showing. I'm going to move the little toolbar out of the way because it's annoying.
I've got it. Yep, so
Okay.
you're good to go.
Thanks, Mike. And by the way, if we run out of time with Q&A, we'll just move to public chat, and you can chat me directly with questions afterwards if you have any. Don't worry. So thank you all very much for being here. I'm really excited to be here. I think this was just an amazing piece of serendipity that this was so ahead of the curve. Ahmed and the team have been doing virtual developer user group stuff for quite a while now, and I know it's been working really great, and I'm a big fan. So I think this is just fantastic. So anyway, I'm going to talk about exploring drag and drop and Lightning Web Components, and there's a little story behind this. Hang on a minute, let me just move the slide deck forward. This is me, Don Robbins. I'm an MVP. I'm a Trailhead Academy instructor. There's my Twitter handle. That's my LinkedIn. Feel free to link to me. Feel free to follow me. Before we actually get into the presentation, I always like to do this. I don't use PowerPoint decks. I use a great web-based tool for my presentations. It's called Reveal.js. It's open source. And what I like to do is I like to expose the presentation to my viewers. I'm not suggesting you go open the presentation now and follow me with it, but for later, I do recommend that you go grab this link now. There's a bit.ly down there. You can use the QR code so that you can come back into the presentation and review it. I have a lot of content that links and curates stuff. And for a refresher, we have a lot of stuff to cover about drag and drop. So I can guarantee you're going to want to come back here, look at stuff. In addition, we're going to have a reference application, and I do make the reference app available to you. It's on GitHub. It's an SFDX project, and I'll give you that link when we get to the end of the presentation, along with a number of other curated links of where you can get more information about this particular topic. Just an aside for my friends in Japan, I have a special connection to Japan. My wife's from Osaka, and I know a bunch of folk, my colleagues in Salesforce Japan. This presentation is also in Japanese, and if you go to the presentation and you bring it up on your browser and you come to the slide and you click that hyperlink, you will be directed to the Japanese version. You'll notice there's a little flag there, and now if you were to navigate backwards and forwards, you're going to see that you're in Japanese. All right, so now I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be presenting in English, but my Japanese colleagues might want to follow along in Japanese, so you have the availability to do that. All right, so let's get going. We've got a lot to cover. Let me just start my stopwatch here. because I've only got about 35 minutes for the content, but I've got a lot to cover. So we'll stop and we'll do questions afterwards. So that's me. I'm a technical educator. For those of you who don't know me, I'm not a Salesforce employee. I'm a Salesforce partner. I'm an 8X MVP. I focus on development, have for 30 years. I'm certified PD2. I teach Salesforce developer courses and have for the last 10 years. I have a team of Salesforce Trailhead Academy instructors. We teach most of the catalog. I also am an author over the years of books and posts and articles, and I've built some Trailhead stuff, including the Data Integration Super Badge, which I was very proud of. And I produce a series on Pluralsight called the Salesforce Play-by-Play series. You may be familiar with it. I'll give you some more information at the end of the presentation where you can go and look that stuff up. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about drag and drop use cases, where drag and drop works, what it is. We're going to sort of start at the foundation and talk about the concepts. We'll talk about drag and drop in the standard HTML format, and we'll do a demonstration of that within Visualforce, just as a container for some basic HTML and JavaScript. And then we're going to talk about drag and drop in the context of Lightning Web Components, because it's a little different. And that's what's sort of neat. And that's what I've been exploring and working with. And there's a little bit of a backstory to this. I last worked with drag and drop, about 8 years ago, building out with a JavaScript framework contained in a Visualforce page. And it was really painful. It was so painful that I abandoned it and I left it for like 8 years, and I needed to use it for a project. And I figured, okay, time to learn it. And that's what this exploration comes out of. So it was my exploration. And I hope it will inspire you to go do your own exploration, because it's really neat right now with HTML5 and modern JavaScript, and it works fantastic with Lightning Web Components, and that's what we're going to cover. So we're going to show 2 different architectural approaches: a tightly coupled Lightning Web Component pattern and a loosely coupled, meaning the app builder. And then I'm going to point you at where you can learn more. What we will not cover, what we will not dig into, is the full drag and drop JavaScript API. There's a lot more to it when you're dealing with it in an HTML environment. There's some stuff that I'm not going to do because I found I didn't need it in Lightning Web Components. So we're not going to go there. We're not going to talk about drag and drop in Aura. It can be done. I've seen examples. But we're not going there. We're certainly not going to talk about drag and drop in the context of non-HTML platforms like drag and drop in mobile or WinForms or anything like that. And we're certainly not going to talk about drag and drop in mobile. It's very similar, but we're not going there. We're talking about drag and drop in a web application, either straight HTML or Lightning Web Components. So here's a typical Salesforce use case, and this is what inspired me on this exploration. It's like, oh, geez, we can do drag and drop with Lightning Web Components. Salesforce is doing it. Why can't we do it? This is the Kanban board that most of you may have seen. If you haven't, you should play with it. This is available for any standard or custom object. It's very well known in the opportunity domain, but you can put up your own Kanban board. It's limited in what it does, but if it does what you need it to do, it's great. I needed it to do more, and that's why I went off to do this exploration. So that's one particular use case. Another common one is you might have a map component and you want to drag around that pin and have it change the address or maybe the geolocation data in the record. So that's just another use case for drag and drop. And a very common use case for drag and drop, probably seen it all over the place, is dragging a file into an uploader, and that's all over the place. So drag and drop is really common with images and with files. As a matter of fact, those 2 elements in HTML5 are by default. Those 2 elements are always draggable. And you may have noticed that if you're on any browser and you click on an image and you start to even inadvertently drag it, you'll notice that it looks like it's draggable, but it doesn't seem you can drop it anywhere. And that's something we're going to talk about. Let's talk about what drag and drop actually is. And we're going to go through very quickly. It's a programmatic mechanism whereby a user can select and move an element on a page to another area of a page. And it's a physical gesture, right? You're clicking, you're holding the mouse key down, and you're dragging it, and then you're releasing it, and now the image magically shows up somewhere else on the page, right? And if you want to know more about drag and drop, you can go into Wikipedia. This is a hyperlink in my slide deck, and you can see that little image on the right. You can read all about it in all its gory detail. We're going to break it down to specifically what you need to know about using it with Lightning Web Components. So what happens in drag and drop? Right? A user clicks on some displayed element that has been predefined by a developer as being draggable. The user holds the mouse key down and drags it across the screen, and usually sees some visual effects as they're doing that. And then when they are over a certain target area on the screen, there must be some kind of intuitive clue visually that it is a target, they can release the mouse, and voila, the element appears at the new location. And usually there's some associated logic going on in the background that's making this happen. And it's also potentially affecting data, particularly if it's a business application. So here's just a quick example of drag and drop. And I've got this actually built into the slides. This image is draggable. And you can see I can drag it all over the screen. And these are obvious targets. And if I release over the target, boom, I've dropped it. I can drag it over this target and boom, I can drop it again and I can drop it back. But notice what happens if I try to drop it back here, it won't go. And the reason is programmatic. I have actually told this interface that I don't want to allow the image to be droppable on the original source container that I originally dragged it from. That's my choice as a designer. I could allow it, but I've chosen not to. So that's a very simple example of drag and drop with an image. And that is using standard HTML and very basic standard JavaScript. So how does it work in HTML? Well, we have a movable element that has an attribute, and all HTML elements have attributes, and there's a draggable attribute. By default, on almost all HTML elements, draggable by default is set false. But you can turn it to true. And as I said earlier, images and hyperlinks, by default, draggable is set to true. Now, you're going to have a container element. This is going to be where you think you're going to want to drop the element. And what we need to do is those elements, which are typically containers, like divs, or maybe an unordered list, or a table. It's a container element. And you're going to use JavaScript to set a listener on that element. And the listeners are going to be bound to JavaScript handlers so that they can handle a specific event related to that target element. The handler also, when we start to drag something, that draggable element also has a listener and some handlers. And what they do is when we start to drag an element, we have to capture some information about it. And one of the ways we do that is there is actually a payload object, a data transfer object available on the event that we're handling that allows you to stuff some data inside the data transfer object. So usually we'll put perhaps the ID of the element or some other piece of data and something called drop effects. Drop effects are part of that JavaScript API for drag and drop that I'm not really going to talk about, but that's one of the things that you would also put in that DTO payload on the JavaScript object. The handlers will then manipulate the DOM and any potential data. That's how it works. When you do the drop, there's a handler, manages the drop, and then it changes the DOM so that the draggable element is actually repositioned in the DOM to now show up where it was you want it to visually show up. Now, there are a lot of handlers, and not all of them are necessary for you to actually set listeners on and handle. And we're going to talk about what those handlers are that are placed on the two types of HTML elements that we care about. The first element is that draggable element. So that image, for example, that's a selected element being dragged from inside some source container to some target container. Maybe it's a URL, maybe it's an image, maybe it's a lightning card, etc. That's the first kind of HTML element that will have some events associated with it. Then we have the target container. That's the target container element where we want that dragged element to eventually end up. The container element that the selected element can be dragged over and or dropped onto. I mean, you might drag over it, but not drop into it. But when we can handle those events as well, and that's going to be a div or a list, etc. So those are the two elements, and each of these elements, these types of elements, has their own set of events, and they're slightly different. We'll start with the draggable element itself. The draggable element has a drag start event, it has a drag event, and it has a drag end event. And if you notice that asterisk, that simply means that if you want this to work, you must set the listener for drag start. You must handle the drag start event. The other two are optional. Now, if we look at the target containers, we have 4 events. We have a drag enter event. We have a drag over event. We have a drag leave event. And of course, we have the most important one. We have the drop event. And you'll notice that the drag enter and the drag over and the drop are required. You've got to handle those if you want this to work. You don't have to handle the drag leave. Now, the thing about the required versus non-required, those non-required events are typically so you can modify the presentation as you know that this event is firing. Oh, I'm dragging something. I want to change the CSS of what this thing looks like. Or I've stopped dragging it, therefore I want to reset it to what it was in its normal state, etc. So that's the most common usage for the events that you don't have to handle. They're there for your convenience, so to speak. Now, there are usually multiple target containers. I don't say usually, it depends on your use case, but there certainly can be. There's going to be at least one, and there's likely to be multiples. All right, so those are the 7 events. What we're going to do is we're going to break them down. Before we demonstrate this, we're going to break them down individually because we want to talk about some considerations for each one of these events. The first is the drag start event. Now, this is on the draggable element. This is an event that's going to fire when you first drag, you begin to drag the element, right? You click on it and you hold the mouse down and you start to drag it. And you have to handle this. You have to set this up and you got to handle it. One of the things you really need to do here is you're going to have to capture something that represents what it is you're dragging, because eventually when you drop it, you're basically passing a message that this is the thing that was being operated on. So this is where we usually capture the element ID in this case. Maybe it's the element ID of that image tag. And then we also typically want to capture the element ID of the container that it lives in at the time that we start to drag it, because we want to be able to compare this to where we're dropping it, because we don't want to go through certain operations if we really haven't moved it. If we start dragging it out of a source container and we end up back on the source container, well, it's going to try to process the drop event if we have it set up that way. And there's no reason to, because we came from that container. So this is a way of being able to do some validation on that. And we also typically would load the data, the ID of the element, and maybe some drop effects into the events data transfer object if we're using standard HTML5. In Lightning Web Components, we're going to do something else. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. One very important other task to handle during the handling of the drag start event is to set some CSS or some presentation on the dragged element itself. Maybe we want to change its border to be, dashed. Maybe we want to change its opacity. Maybe we want to turn it a different color. Well, this is where we do it. This is where we would set that CSS. Now, the drag event itself is what is firing as we're dragging it. And it continues to fire every few hundred milliseconds. And if you were actually writing out to the JavaScript console as you were dragging this, you would see these things spinning out into the console. So there's some performance issues going on here as well. You want to be aware of that. This is a firing event. So if you don't use it because it is not required, you'll probably improve your performance. If you do use it, you're going to have a little bit of a CPU hit. It's typically used, again, to affect the CSS presentation. And again, this is optional. And then we have the drag end event. Also optional, it fires as the drag operation ends, and it's typically used to reset CSS presentation. All right, so those are the 3 on the draggable element. Let's talk about the target container. The target container starts with the drag enter event. Well, what is the drag enter event? Well, it's when the item that you're dragging is more than 50% of its dimension inside that container. At that point, when the majority of the real estate of the dragged element appears inside the boundary of that target container, the drag enter will fire. It's required. You have to handle this. And something new here. Your handler, your JavaScript handlers, its first task is to call a special JavaScript method called prevent default. And what that does on the object itself, on the target element, is it prevents whatever its default behavior would likely be if it happened to catch that mouse event that you were on it. maybe because you don't want that to happen. I mean, maybe it's something that fires something off when you click on it or drag over it. You don't want that to happen. So you're basically short stopping its default behavior. Very important point. We're not going to go into detail how that works. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to point you to where you can read about it. You must call it. And again, we're typically going to maybe reset the presentation of that target container and show that it is being dragged over, etc. Here's the drag over. Sorry, that was the drag enter. Now the drag over, same thing. It fires as we're moving over that target container. Again, it continues to fire. It is required. And it too should call the prevent default. And again, it's typically used just to reset the presentation. And then we have the drag leave. Maybe I dragged over it, but I'm now outside the bounds. Then the drag leave event will fire as you leave the drop target. It's optional, and it's typically used for CSS presentation. And this, of course, is the granddaddy. This is the most important one. This is the drop event. The drop event on a target container will fire when you release the mouse. And you have to handle this, obviously. If you're doing drag and drop, you want to handle the drop event. It must call the prevent default method. And here's where in standard HTML, you're going to do the work. This is where all the work happens. If I'm dragging an item from one container to another, the whole point of that is I'm changing where it lives in the DOM. So I'm going to change something about the drag elements association with the DOM, saying, well, now you're a child not of where you came from, but where I'm dropping you. And that's really all that's going on here. We're manipulating the DOM. And if you have any additional data or logic, this is, of course, the JavaScript function where you would handle this. It is also going to be used to reset the CSS when you're all done. You want to set everything back to normal. All right. So let's see how we would handle implementing this, a standard HTML in Salesforce. Well, a simple way to do it is in a Visualforce page. And in this Visualforce page, which I'm going to demo in just a second, I've got a very standard container Visualforce page. It has 3 divs. And if you look at the brown one, I'll use my mouse cursor here. Notice it's just a div. It has an ID of a source container. It has a data dash attribute I call data role because we want to identify this as a drop source as opposed to these two are drop targets, right? That's very important. We're going to use those when we set up the event listeners. And then I've got this image. This is the draggable element. Notice it's an image. It's got an ID. And it is draggable equals true. Now, I don't have to say draggable equals true because it's an image, and all images are by default. The draggable attribute is set to true, but I'm just doing this so it's really, really visible. Anything you want to drag is going to have to set draggable equals to true. All right, let's actually look at the demo. I'm going to shrink down my screen a little bit, and I'm going to open up another tab here. And this is a Visualforce page inside a little project that you're going to be able to build on your own. And this should look a little familiar, similar to what I did in the slide. And again, I can drag into this box, which would represent working cases from new cases, and then escalated, right? And I can drag these back and forth. But again, I cannot drop them back into the new category box. And that, again, is by design, all right? So that's how that works. Let me show you what this looks like in Visual Studio. Just quickly give you a picture of the project that you'll be able to download from Git. It's called the LWC D&D demos. There is a README which will tell you how to set it up. I just want to open up the page code. Here it is, and it's just close that guy. It's just a Visualforce page that's doing nothing but pretty much HTML. I think the only exception to that is I've got a $ resource for that image, dollar resource case. That's that little case, that little briefcase. Other than that, it's just a couple of divs. And you'll notice that the image starts in the source container, and then the idea is in drag and drop, we're going to be able to drop it into either of the drop targets. And then down below is a pile of JavaScript. Now this is sort of global JavaScript, right? Because this is Visualforce. This is not Lightning Web Components. So there's a whole bunch of event handlers here. I'm not going to walk through them here in the page. I'm going to go back to the presentation because I've got some better representations of the code here. Let's go look at this. So here we've got the 3 containers, and the first container has the image. Here's the image. Remember, it's data role drag drop source instead of target. Here's the draggable attribute. Other than that, it's just an image. And here's the other, that's the first drag drop target. That's the working box. And here's the escalated box, nothing else in there. It's just a div. And they have the data role of drag, drop, target. Here's where in the JavaScript we set the handlers, and we're simply doing a query select all on the drag drop targets and looping through the collection of divs that have that data dash rule set, and we're simply adding the events. And we're binding them to a couple of those JavaScript events that we had in the page. And then we do something similar to any element that is draggable. There's only one, there's just that image. And we set the drag start, drag, and drag end. So in HTML, it's very, very straightforward, and we're just using standard JavaScript. Let's take a look at that JavaScript. Here's the drag start, which is where we capture the event as a parameter to the function, and we're grabbing the event target, that's the image, its ID, its element ID, and I'm setting it into the data transfer object of the event. Now you'll notice there's a little catch block here, and that's because normally you want to set text plain on this data, but Microsoft browsers are a little squirrely and they require this alternate for text because they don't blah, blah, blah. This is why I don't like using the data transfer object. We'll come back to that concept later. And then here's where I'm capturing the ID of the parent element of that image so that I know where it was dragged from when it starts getting dragged, right? So that's to handle the start of the drag. Here's the drop, which is the most important one. This is going to happen on a target container. And what am I doing? I'm looking at the ID of the target container and I'm comparing it to the source container ID. This is an application scope, and that's why I have access to it. And I want to make sure they don't match, but if they do match, it means I've dropped the image on the same place I grabbed it from, and why bother, right? So if it's a different container, then I do a get data to get the ID of the element, and then I say, you know what, on this new element that is the target on the event, I'm going to change the parent of that image. I'm going to say, well, now I'm your parent. Previously it was the source container, now it's me, the target container, and now you're going to appear beneath me in the DOM hierarchy. And that's all that's going on here. We're simply manipulating the DOM. We're telling the dragged element who its current parent is, and we do it on the drop. And that's it. We're not managing any data here. We're not dealing with anything in Salesforce. We're just demonstrating the basics of the HTML drag and drop. We're not talking about Lightning Web Components yet. Now we're going to go about Lightning Web Components. So how do you implement HTML drag and drop in Lightning Web Components? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Got 12 minutes to get through this. There's some very basic differences. Both of them manipulate the DOM, but they manipulate the DOM differently. We use Lightning Web Component also to broker those drag and drop events. We do handle those drag and drop events in the module of the component, but then in order to talk to other components, we use custom events. We abandon that DTO and the drop effects and putting the ID in the DTO, and we use custom events and the data payload instead to send a message up through the hierarchy. Now, Lightning Web Components, the whole point of doing drag and drop in Lightning Web Components is likely to change some data. So we facilitate, we use Lightning Web Components to facilitate that data manipulation. And then because the data has changed, we use data-driven reactive rendering to modify the DOM. We want to avoid standard DOM manipulation in Lightning, right? We want to use the framework. Don't fight the framework. We want to use reactive rendering in the framework. So again, let's summarize. Lightning Web Components, Lightning Web Components declare and handle the drag and drop events, and we broker them with custom events. Those messages travel up through the component hierarchy to a top-level master component. That's I believe, a best practice architectural pattern. The master component does whatever data manipulation is necessary, and essentially refetching the data that might be displayed in any of its nested components. And because that data is contained in tracked properties like lists, arrays, etc., that change will trigger reactive rendering back down through the hierarchy, which is a very important aspect of Lightning Web Components. And essentially the UI will refresh itself. We do not manipulate the DOM. The framework manipulates the DOM. We use the events to change the data, and we let the framework do it for us. Now, when dealing with Lightning Web Components, there's typically two architectural approaches. One is tightly coupled, where we've got components in a tight nested hierarchy, and maybe it's attached to a Lightning tab. And then, well, wait a minute, what if I wanted to drop these container components on an app page, configure them, but still be able to drag and drop across them? Well, we can do that, and we would communicate between them with a pubsub model or with the new Lightning messaging service. So those are the two architectures, and here are what they look like. Here is 3 components, a case picker. That's the master component that's handling all the data. And then we've got 3 instances of the case list component, and they're going to have filtered lists of cases with each of a specific status. And then those lists will load themselves on an iteration with a case card, a case item, and you're going to see the status, etc. And as we drag and drop one to the other, the data will be processed through the eventing by the master component, and the lists will automatically re-render when we refetch the entire case list and refilter the arrays that are handed into each list. If we want to do this in a pubsub model, it's almost identical. This is an app page as a container. The difference is we have this sort of a substitute wrapper component, calling it the case list for page, and it is used to wrap each of the case lists, and it manages all that data. It brokers the custom event that comes up from the lower components, and it does a pubsub throughout the app page, and the other pages, the other components, of course, will react to them. So let's see what this looks like in Lightning Web Components. Go back to my demo app. Here's the tightly coupled. And what I have here is I've taken these 3 different statuses and I've created lists, and these are actual cases. I'm going to reset this. I can reset this so that all of them are new. And by the way, there's no save operation I need to process after I drop it. That's my design choice. If I grab this guy and notice the styling changes, and now I'm overworking, and I could go overworking, and now I'm leaving working, and now I'm in escalated, and if I drop it, the data is going to refresh, the lists are going to refresh. It's not here anymore. Now it's over there. And I could do that with all of these. I could drop them, I could drop them, I could drop them. Notice that the status is also changing. And notice if I go over here to the case, this is just the standard case object, you're going to see that the status values of those records, they were changed. When I dropped it, the record is updated and the lists are refreshed. Right? Now, if I come into, I'm going to reset this, and if I come into the loosely coupled, this is an app page. And this is the same user interface, it's just that these are stacked. And again, I can drag out of one list into another list. Notice what happens if I try to drag it back into the new list. I've got a validation that pops up a toast. I'm not allowing it. Plus, I have the ability to put some validation in there. All right. So that's what it looks like. Let's wrap up the slides because I want you to see the code. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to go back to my presentation. Here we go. So let's look at the Lightning Web Component code. We'll do it very quickly. You're going to explore the code in the app itself. That's your homework. I always give homework. Here is the draggable component. This is the case item. And notice that I'm not making the Lightning card draggable. I'm making the container div draggable. And that's also where I'm identifying the listeners to be, not the card. Why? Because the card is a base Lightning component. And you can only do so much with base Lightning components. They're encapsulated. So what I want to do is I want to wrap it in a div, and I want to make the div draggable. All right, so that's what I've done with that. Now, remember when I started to drag it, the CSS changed. Well, that's because I have a special class called drag, and I apply that class on the drag start, and it changed that border style to dashed, and it changed the opacity. So that's very simple. Here's the drag start. What am I doing? Well, I'm grabbing the original status of where this case is, what its original status is, that's its data, and then I'm saying, oh, by the way, go get me that div and add the drag class, and now let's dispatch a custom event. The item is called the custom event item is called item drag, and I'm putting the data. There's the payload. That's the target ID is the case records ID itself, and what its original status is, because I need to know that when I drop it, and then I'm dispatching it. And that's going to go up to the list. Here's the list. I'm handling from the case item right here on item drag, That's where it comes up now that I've started dragging it. So the list is going to handle that drag start in addition to its own events, the drag enter, drag over, and drag leave, and the drop. It's very important. Let's go look at what it does. It also has a class to show that it's being dragged over that I would set. And here's the little functions that set that, either add it or remove it with some helper functions. Very straightforward stuff. I'm just toggling the class here on the div. That's all that's going on with those. Here's where I'm handling the child items drag start, where I'm just marshaling it. I'm brokering it back up to the master component, but I'm not doing any data manipulation, and I'm not doing any data manipulation on the drop either. I'm simply handing it to the master component, that case picker, because its responsibility is to handle everything. Here's the case picker HTML, where I basically explicitly have 3 case lists, 1 for each status. I'm binding a filtered list. Let's go look at what that, here's all the JavaScript. This is where all the smarts are, right? Here's where I get the list of all cases from Apex, and where I'm also setting up to do an update on the case when it has its status changed, as well as a refresh Apex to refetch that list. And we're almost there. Here's where I'm setting the filtered lists for each of those lists. That's just using JavaScript filtering. Really simple, but very, very convenient. This is an outlier, and the outlier is reactive because when I do the drop, I'm doing the validation, make sure I'm not putting it where I shouldn't. And here, if I can drop it, I do an update record with the ID and the new status. And then, of course, I call refresh Apex on the original wire. And that's what causes the lists to refresh. And voila, the UI refreshes itself appropriately. And that's it. So remember, the key points. You want to understand the basics of drag and drop events. You don't want to fight the framework. You want to take advantage of what you can leverage with data manipulation and with reactive rendering. You want to leverage those custom events to do the communication because of the encapsulation model. You want to leverage the data capabilities and the reactive rendering that's caused from that data manipulation. And you're going to use event handlers primarily to change the style. In addition to manipulating the data, it's to change the presentation of the items that you're dragging and that you're dragging over. And you probably want to follow this architectural model of having a master component. It's a good Lightning Web Component architectural pattern. You don't have to. Sometimes it actually doesn't work as well. There's always exceptions, but it's typically a good place to start. That's what I did. I actually didn't. I started at the child, having the child do its own data, and I realized, no, I want to take advantage of the reactive rendering being trickled down through the hierarchy. So if you really like this and you want to do more, here's what you can do. This is a QR code and a URL for the project that I showed you with the Visualforce and the loosely coupled and tightly coupled. It's an SFDX project, has a README, tells you how to install it. You can just run it and it should work without any problems. I've tested it laboriously. You can reach out to me if you have a problem with it. You can also download and dissect from the gallery the e-bikes app, because this was written mostly, I think, by Rene Winkelmeyer, Evangelist. He's got some drag and drop in here, and you should go look at that. He uses that data transfer object. Here's where you can learn basic fundamentals about drag and drop. This is a course on Pluralsight by a really great author named Craig Shoemaker. This is on HTML fundamentals, so really great to brush up on that. But the key here is that Module 7 is all about drag and drop in the HTML space, basically what I covered at the beginning of this presentation. This is a great medium post on short stopping using prevent default and stop propagation. We don't need stop propagation because by default, our custom events are stopped by the encapsulation model, unless of course we turn bubbles on. But you can read about it there. Here's the API on the Mozilla website. And if you need a primer on Lightning Web Components, I recommend Chuck Liddell's play-by-play with me. It's a free course. You don't need a Pluralsight account to watch this course. Great overview of Lightning Web Components. We did this when they were first released beginning of last year. And we got a lot of great play-by-plays on Lightning and all bunch of stuff. You can go to my website, sfplaybyplay.com. Make sure you put that www in front of it. And then you can get a free Pluralsight 30-day account there if you sign up on my website. This URL, this QR code will take you there. And if you get in there, you can look at all the play-by-plays and you can read about them. It's really cool. You hover over these things and they flip around and they've got the abstract on the other side. And they've got filters here so you can drill down on the topics of interest that you want. Highly recommended. Go get more knowledge. That's it. Don't forget to fill out the survey, which you'd have to go back to, I think, the exhibition hall, and there'll be a link there. And I think my timer says 3 seconds. Remember, visit our sponsors. Follow me at Twitter as well as on Pluralsight. If you follow me on Pluralsight, you'll get a notice when the new course comes out. Learn and share. You know, Leah McGowan-Hare, who did the keynote, don't know if you all saw it, she mentioned this in the keynote. This is what it's all about. Peter Chittum also mentioned this in the keynote. It's that's the magic of the Salesforce Ohana. We learn and share, and we learn as we share. Leah said it really, really well. You know, when you give something back, it comes back around. You get something that you didn't know. And I always like to say that as we teach, we learn. So that's it, Mike. I'm going to turn it back to you to handle questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Don. Lots of great comments about the presentation. Awesome job. First question, what is the best way of testing the drag and drop elements in Salesforce?
Testing in terms of like unit testing in JavaScript, that would be to use the just testing. I do not have it in my app, but it's nothing but you're capturing events. So, and you're manipulating the Lightning Web Components are manipulating the DOM. So after your events fire, after they change data, it would be no different than any other testing you would do on Lightning Web Components to determine if something was being properly addressed and reactively re-rendered in the UI. It's no different. They're just events. That's all they are.
Got it. Do you have to do draggable equals true, or can you just do draggable?
That's a great question because it's binary, and I know that there's some issues with binary attributes. You don't need to do. It depends. Remember that it's not the attribute. The attribute itself is indeed a binary attribute, but its default is false on any element other than images and I think anchors. So if you need to set it true, you can't just say draggable. Draggable, I don't think will default to true, but you know what, whoever asked that question, that's a great question. Why don't you find out, and would you please send me an answer and let me know what you found out. I like to have my students do that. Inform me.
Perfect. Is it possible to order rows in a table with drag and drop?
Yes, I believe it is. I have not done it, but it's my next project.
All right. For this functionality,
wait, hang on. Let me just add something to that. Yep. The way you do it is you're not doing drag and drop to order it. You're setting you have to have it's just a list that's being rendered, right? Remember that while you're dragging it into a particular container slot, you're not manipulating the DOM when you do that drop. The framework is manipulating the DOM. So for example, if it's a list of stuff, and it's going to depend on how you sort that list and what you use to sort that list. That's the key point. And that's up to you as the developer.
All right, for this functionality, are we using any pre-existing HTML JavaScript framework and configure over Lightning Web Components?
No. Nope. HTML5 and JavaScript, it's pure. That's what's so beautiful about it.
All right, next up, are there any trailheads to practice drag and drop events?
Not that I know of.
All right. Any method to mask the visual delay between drop and refreshing the page with the updated date?
Read that again.
Are there any methods to mask the visual delay between drop and refreshing the page with the updated date?
Well, you could put up an interstitial dialog, which would be a modal dialog that would pop up and do a spinner. And then that way the user couldn't do anything until it had refreshed, if that's what you're asking. We do a demonstration of that in the Lightning Web Component Deck 602 course. That's actually one of our exercises.
Got it. So we were setting case status in child components right where we handled the event. I don't
Correct.
know if I fully understand. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, now you don't have, you don't have to. That's an architectural choice. I chose not to have a save button. When we did the drop, I'm actually doing the update, but you don't have to. You could be collecting this in memory, and then you could have a commit or a rollback button. You could do it, you know, an actual formal, now I want to save. Oh no, I don't want to save. That's architectural choice.
Perfect. Is it possible to select multiple and drag as multiple elements?
Say that again.
Is it possible to select multiple elements and drag?
Oh, that's a great question. Don't know. Go try it and let me know.
Good. Does pubsub work with Lightning out? I think so, but I don't know. But I do know that you're going to want to abandon pubsub and adopt the new Lightning messenger service, Lightning messenger service, because one of its whole advantages is it's intended to be used in Visualforce, between Visualforce and Lightning components and all sorts of stuff. And my suspicion is it will work for that. But you'll find out. Cool.
We out of time?
I don't think so.
Right.
I've got another 5 minutes if you do.
I'm good. Keep going.
Cool. Can you do drag and drop on Community Cloud?
Well, if Community Cloud is an app page, essentially, right? It's Flexi page. You should be able to follow the pubsub model. I suspect it would work. And you could actually try that fairly easily if you download the reference application, play with it, and then try putting those components on a community app builder, a community builder page, see if it works. Let me know.
Does drag and drop work in the iPad browser?
Okay, so remember what I said early on. We weren't going to talk about mobile devices. What happens when you get into devices is that the way you interact with drag and drop changes to something called gestures, right? It's not a mouse anymore. Now it's gesture based. You can do drag and drop in devices. However, you have to code your events for gesture-based eventing, not the ones that I've reviewed with you, which only work for desktop-based HTML. So you're going to experiment with that, whoever asked that question, and you're going to let me know.
Great.
Lots of homework.
I love it. I love it. Let's see. A couple requests for the code. I think you've shared that. A comment to understand why you started with Visualforce and Lightning Web Components. You should not modify the DOM. And then a request, can you please do play-by-play session on just tests or testing Lightning Web Components on Pluralsight?
It was in the catalog. So for all my play-by-play fans out there, let me give you a quick update. Because of COVID-19, all sorts of things are shifting. And one of them has to do, of course, with contained spaces. So the play-by-play studio model, you notice the image behind me, that's not a real wall. I could punch through that, right? But that is the studio wall back there. We're on a hiatus right now, and we're trying to figure out what the virtual equivalent is going to be. And when we do, we actually had that. I had Adam Daw lined up to do that. If you don't know Adam Daw, he's done a couple of other play-by-plays. He did the Lightning Web Component, understanding Lightning Web Component for non-Salesforce developers, because JavaScript is his specialty. He also teaches Dex 602 and Dex 450, and he's going to be doing the JavaScript certification prep class for Salesforce as well. He was lined up to do that, but unfortunately we had to put it on hiatus. So eventually I'm hoping it will be in the catalog.
Perfect. And a couple more requests for the code. If you take a look at the slide that's on the presentation.
Yeah, let me show you
now.
where that is. So if you go towards the end of the deck, make sure, so wait a minute. First of all, if you haven't already done it, make sure you write down this bit.ly LWC D&D. This will take you to the Git repo. Sorry, not the Git repo. That will bring up this presentation in your browser. That's what this QR code is. Once you have that, you can go to the slide, go to all these slides, but the slide with the code is this one. So if you go to this GitHub repo, GitHub Force Mentor, that's me, LWC D&D demos, or that QR code will take you there. That is the Git repo, and the instructions are in the README, and that's the code base. You'll want to clone the repo, and you'll want to follow the instructions. Basically, you run a script, and it builds a script. You have to set up a dev hub. That's about all you have to do. You need to authenticate your own dev hub, and then you run the script, and it'll build you the Scratch org, and you can go play.
Perfect. Well, with that, I'm afraid we are out of time. But Don, thank you so very much. A lot of great feedback. Appreciate your presenting, and enjoy the rest of virtual Dreamin.
Thanks, Mike. Can you